happens when a heat wave hits and there's no way to cool down. In this episode of Trailblazing Justice, we confront the deadly consequences of extreme heat inside Oregon prisons. From windowless cells and failing ventilation to a system that treats ice cubes like a reward, we ask, how many lives must be at risk before we act? It's all coming up on Trailblazing Justice. This is Trailblazing Justice, episode 74, recorded Friday, August 15, 2025. Heatwave behind bars. It's time for Trailblazing Justice, the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Here's Bobbin.
Welcome back to another episode of Trailblazing Justice. I'm Bobbin Singh, the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And we're back after a couple weeks off, and glad to be back. Today we'll be talking about climate change and its impact in prisons, especially just extreme weather-related events. And joining me today will be Mark Wilson, who's a paralegal with the organization, Angela Kim, who's a policy advocate for the Women's Justice Project, and Julia Yoshimoto, the director of our Women's Justice Project. But before we begin, I have a really exciting announcement. Coming up in September, we're excited to share that we'll be hosting a benefit for our program, the Oregon Innocence Project, featuring a special guest. Very much looking forward to. Calvin Duncan has strong connections to Oregon because he was recently a student at Lewis and Clark Law School, getting his JD in 2023. Calvin's story starts way before that, though. He was falsely accused of murder at the age of 19 in Louisiana. He endured a life sentence without the possibility of parole for more than 28 years, including in the notorious Angola prison. While incarcerated, he became an inmate counsel substitute or a jailhouse lawyer, helping hundreds of fellow incarcerated people challenge wrongful conviction and unjust sentences. This year, along with co-author Sophie Cole, Calvin published his memoir, The Jailhouse Lawyer. It tells the story of his 30-year path through Louisiana's prison system after his wrongful murder conviction, his coming of age as a legal mind while in prison, and his continued advocacy for those inside. The benefit this fall, at September 11th, will be featuring Calvin Duncan, will take place at the Eco Trust building in Portland. All proceeds will support our work right here in Oregon to help wrongfully convicted people clear their names and free them from prison. And tickets are now on sale. Visit OregonInnocence.org/thisisinnocence for full details. If you're a business owner and would like to introduce yourself to our wonderful community, to what you do, and support a good cause while you're doing it, you can get in touch with our Director of Engagement, Allie King. Allie can talk you through our partnership opportunities we have available. You can email Allie at aking@ojrc.info. We look forward to seeing you there. It should be an exciting event, and I know one of the nice things is Mark is going to be hosting Calvin that day and picking him up from the airport and driving him around. And Mark has, I think, a lot of shared sort of experiences with Calvin of being a prolific, Mark himself being a prolific, what they call a jailhouse lawyer here in Oregon. And so I think I look forward to hearing about those conversations. We're hoping to get Calvin involved in some of the work that we're doing here also. So should be fun. I wanted to talk with you both about prisons and extreme weather events, basically the impacts of climate change on prisons, but just simply extreme weather events that are happening in prisons. And the reason why this feels relevant is because here in Oregon, we've just kind of come off of 2 weeks of very hot weather, 90-degree, near 100-degree weather some days. And I don't think people fully appreciate or understand what it's like in the prisons for people and just how bad it can get, both during extreme heat situations, but during the winter when it's very cold. Potentially, like we saw during the wildfires that existed here, there could be flooding events or floods. But I don't know, Mark and Angela, I think it'd be helpful just for folks to get a brief introduction from the two of you. So why don't we start with you, Angela? Do you mind just giving a quick introduction of who you are and how you came to be at the OJRC?
Sure. I'm Angela Kim, and I work for the Women's Justice Project as a policy associate. And I came to OJRC about 2 months after I was released in 2023 and began work doing document preparation, and then moved into working with the Women's Justice Project.
Yeah, and you've been doing great work. You've been helping out providing insights and information and your own knowledge based on your experiences to helping support the women that Julia and the Women's Justice Project support that the Women's Justice Project provide to women inside. And now you're helping us with some policy initiatives or thinking about how we can make some additional suggestions for reforms to the institution. So it's been very nice to have you on board. Mark, you want to just give a quick introduction to who you are?
Well, I think you already did. I'm Mark. I am paralegal here since January of this year. When I was released from 37 and a half years of incarceration, I spent probably about 30 of that or so helping prisoners access the courts inside. And so I'm enjoying doing the same thing out here in the community and giving voice to issues like this that usually go ignored, except for the people that are suffering inside and their families. And so, thanks for listening, everybody.
Julia, you want to give just a quick introduction to yourself as well?
My name is Julia Yoshimoto. I am the project director for the Women's Justice Project. I've been doing this work for now a little over 10 years at OJRC, and we provide legal services to women who are incarcerated at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. And from the stories that people share with us, we look for trying to better understand and better educate the public about women's experiences through the criminal process. But I'd also like to add a little bit more to Angela's bio because I think she's very modest. But Angela also is a retired nurse and has had a career in the medical field prior to incarceration. And she's also a very observant and astute person. And while incarcerated, really saw the types of things that were going on for people and has a particular interest in the way operations were impacting people that she was serving time with. And she has a real heart for trying to improve the medical care for people that are incarcerated in Oregon's prisons because she can see the very detrimental impact that the sort of low quality level of medical services is having on individuals and on their families.
Well, thanks for adding that. And thanks for all of you being here. So I guess, Mark, Angela, I mean, what would be helpful is maybe talk a little bit about, if you could, within a few minutes, just talk about, if you could describe sort of physically what it's like to be in prison. What are the cells like and how do they vary? And what is sort of like the general level of infrastructure that exists in the prisons? Because that'll help set some context for when we start talking about like extreme weather events, sort of it helps sort of situationally locate people into what it is that we're talking about. So, Angela, I know we've talked a lot about Coffee Creek previously on previous episodes, but I don't know that we've ever spent some time just talking about like the physical infrastructure of Coffee Creek. You mind giving us a little bit of an overview of what that was like and, generally what people are experiencing inside?
Absolutely. Coffee Creek is it's a very cold and austere environment. Everything is concrete and metal. So your floors are concrete. They're just bare. We put down wax over it. Sometimes the floors can be shiny because of the wax that's been laid down. But in the winter, if you can imagine, concrete can get very cold and it holds that coldness. The same thing happens in the summertime. Once the concrete heats up, it's very hard to cool off. So it holds the heat for quite some time after the ambient air temperature has cooled. So once we've had 90 plus degree heat for a couple of days, that concrete has heated up. And even though the temperature may drop outside, it holds on to that heat for quite some time after that. So the conditions inside continue to bake even after the outside temperature has cooled. And that can happen for, 2 or 3 days after it's cooled off outside, because once that's heated up, it holds on to the heat and there isn't a lot of ventilation or cooling mechanism to cool that back down again.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. I mean, so you have metal and concrete buildings, cell doors. You have also dormitory style, living places. You have a lot of people in small contained places, and like you said, not insulated but concrete kind of structures. So the temperature, when you put a lot of people in a room, or even two people in a room, the temperature increases that by itself. So you just mentioned like the ventilation. So what are we talking about? I mean, is there AC? Are there ventilation units? I mean, do cells have is there a centralized AC system, or what are we talking about here?
There is no AC system. They have big, large swamp coolers that generally cool the housing units. The classrooms and the administrative offices are air conditioned. So if you're going into a classroom where volunteers or outside people are coming into the institution and they're holding meetings or classes, those rooms are very comfortable during the heat waves that we have. But the housing units are very hot, and you can feel it as soon as you walk into a housing unit. It's very noticeable that those areas are not cooled. And also, depending on which unit you live in, if you get that late afternoon sun that beats through the windows that are on half of the unit, that section of the housing unit will be even hotter than the rest of the housing unit. And it will also, once again, hold on to that heat for some time longer than the rest of the housing unit.
Yeah, and we jumped right into the extreme weather situation of heat, like extreme heat, and we'll talk about the cooler side of things. The and just people may not be familiar with what a swamp cooler is. Can you explain that?
It just pumps water through it. And so it's convection. It's a type of convection cooling where you're pumping water through and the air passes over the water and that's how it cools the air temperature.
Yeah.
So it's not air conditioning at all in any way, shape, or form.
It's like a bucket of water with a fan on top of it.
Yes.
Yeah. It's an interesting sort of apparatus. And so you have swamp coolers kind of pushing air around and whatever ventilation system, but there's not like we'll get more into the details about how people stay cool. But Mark, you want to give us a little bit of comparison to the men's prison, or what it was like at OSCI?
Sure. So, Coffee Creek was built in 2000. So it could have AC, but they chose not to have it. And they have swamp coolers. OSCI was built in like 1947, and OSP was built in the 1800s. There are no swamp coolers. It's just the steel and concrete. So your cells are, 60 square feet with two people, metal bunk beds, a toilet, sometimes a metal table and stool. So small spaces, but a lot of those have solid doors as well and sealed windows. Some cells have windows that can open, but that's very rare. So typically you're in a confined space. It would be like, for the heat, imagine, getting in your car that's been sitting in the hot sun for a couple of hours and how hot it is in there. There's a reason why it's against the law to keep your child or your pet in a enclosed car because it kills people. These cells are kind of the same thing. Like Angela was saying, is they retain the heat. And so it's not necessarily the hot day today, it's 100 degrees outside, it feels miserable in here. Yes, it does, but it's an accumulative effect of that over days and days and days, because it does retain the heat. We've had times where they've taken the temperature. So there's different tiers of cells as well. OSP has 5 tiers of cells. The highest in OSCI are 3 tiers. The higher you go up, the hotter it gets. And so I remember a couple years back, they took the temperature at OSCI in one of the cells on the top tier, and it was 127 degrees in the cell. And it was, we're in there around the clock. There's not much relief at all for that, and you have to make your own kinds of relief for that. Usually, they've done some things over the years where they've sold cooling towels. They've sold these small battery operated fans. If you're incentive level 3, if you're the
All right,
highest,
we'll come back into that. But as we're talking about the structures, I think we'll just stick with the hot weather stuff today, just because
Sure.
we're in the middle of summer. And recently I've just seen a couple of different articles from around the country about high temperatures in the prisons, just how hot it gets, and basically echoing a lot of the things that you're talking about as far as, this concrete heats up and there's no relief, and the ventilation systems are sparse to minimal, and if there are cooling mechanisms, they're the equivalent of just like big fans or swamp coolers that are essentially just pushing around hot air. When it does get hot like this, can you talk a little bit about, you're talking about temperatures like in the upper 90s, you're talking, Mark, like above 100 degrees sustained, it is just hot. Like for me, when it gets above 80 degrees, I feel like my cognitive abilities start declining by each degree significantly. Like, by the time we get to 90, I'm like, I just need to be in something cool and lie down. Can you both talk a little bit about what is the overall sort of feeling, the morale, how do people operate? Like, are people moving around? Are people active? When people see those temperatures, like in the weather report, I mean, what is it that people are feeling during those times, and what is sort of the mood inside the prisons?
I know just from having worked in healthcare that during the summertime, the incidences of anger issues and fights increases. People become very irritable if you are exposed to that kind of temperature for any long prolonged amount of time. And so it affects both the AICs and the staff that are working there. When they're working on the housing unit, they become very irritable. It's just as hot for them as it is for us. Well, except they're not enclosed in a cell for extended periods of time. And they do provide the staff with a fan right behind their desk, but it affects everyone who's working there. And so you do have people who have shorter fuses, more explosive outbursts, because it just makes everyone very irritable.
Yeah. It makes me irritable. So, Mark, I always hear about like how, people are on edge and, things become potentially more violent during like the hotter days.
Yeah. So one of the articles I recently saw mentioned that OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, recommends indoor temperatures between 68 and 76 degrees. And, in these temperatures, you're never anywhere near that. You're always 80 and 80 plus. And, and the reason they recommend that, I think, is because of these health impacts. And the health impacts are, again, this is cumulative. It's, when you're in these temperatures for this long period of time, you're sleep deprived. It's people are lethargic. Like you say, it's hard to think. There's symptoms of heat exhaustion. We've seen people pass out from heat exhaustion or heat stroke and fall downstairs. There's real impacts, and yeah. So these are confined spaces with a lot of people. You're always, bumping into people generally, outside these hot temperatures. And so these people have shorter fuses, both guards and prisoners, like Angela was talking about. And, conflict is inevitable. And so imagine, you're stuck in that space in your bathroom, and it's 100 degrees and you have another person in there with you 24 hours a day. There's conflict amongst you in this space. There's conflict outside that space with other people. And another part of that creates the conflict is that a lot of times when the temperatures are like that, the default for the prison is to lock you in your cage because it's too hot outside for the guards, because they have provisions in their contracts or whatever that they, don't have to work outside if it's more than 90 degrees or whatever. And so then they close the yard. Well, the yard is the only place for you to get outside, and there's no shade out in the yard. There's no trees, there's no cover, there's nothing like that. But at least there might be a breeze because of our work in, I think it was 2019 or 2020. The governor required the prisons to put misters on the yard where you could walk through it and get some cool water from the mister occasionally. So getting out to the yard kind of helped that a little bit, but because the guards have these provisions in their contracts, when it gets up to that temperature, they cancel the yard, and then you're just stuck in your cell for longer periods of time. And that just makes people, angrier as well. The lack of being able to get outside, the fact that they're essentially being punished because, the guards, don't want to work in these temperatures. And, it's just endless. It's a vicious cycle of a lot of different factors building on each other in the heat.
And there's a heavier consequence, right, for AICs to have conflicts or to have disagreements with guards. Could you talk about what that means for AICs to have to live in that environment where if you're at home and you're, for us not in prison, if you're at home, you're in an argument with someone, your family, it's just people are irritable. But in prison, if you're having conflicts, what are the consequences of that for people?
Yeah. So a lot of times, the interactions between guards and prisoners typically remain professional for the most part, except isolated incidents. But when everybody's hot and irritable and miserable, people lose their temper, and when a guard loses their temper, their response is throw him in the hole. Get it. I don't want him to be my problem in here. Get him out of my face, and I'm going to lock him up. And so when you go to SEG, that's an environment that is, for whatever reason, SEG is even hotter than the other places. I think it's because it's more confined, less circulation, more bodies in cages right next to each other. It always feels hotter in SEG or colder in SEG in the wintertime than general population. So that's a big part of it, is you go to segregation, but going to segregation can mean impacts that cause you to serve more time in prison. It can affect, if somebody's going to the parole board, it can affect their ability to get out of prison that way. If people are eligible for good time, or what's called earned time credit now, they can lose that, and that causes them to do more time in prison. So the heat can have those kind of impacts as well.
And this happens every year. So every year, this situation or this environment comes up, and year after year, it's just getting hotter and hotter. And when people, if they have a bad moment, they could lose everything. They'll lose their programming, they'll lose their housing placement. Ending up in SEG, it's just that in itself will be a terrible experience. And then it can shift, how they serve the rest of their time for that, because of however traumatic that was. And then in addition to that, lose, your earned time credits, or, and be in jeopardy at the parole board. And then every year this will come around because it's hot. Every year.
Well, and the ironic part about that is, a lot of times, if you're in a Valley prison, in a Salem prison, if you have one of those encounters during the heat, you're likely to get transferred to one of the Eastern Oregon prisons, where over half of our prisoners are already. So you're going to get transferred to a hotter environment. So yeah, it's just the consequences are endless, and people don't. There's nobody that really intervenes and says, hey, come on now. Everybody's hot and miserable, and let's kind of rethink this, and let's not go to the extreme measure here. And it's never that. It's always I'm pissed off, and you're going to say,
For many years at Coffee Creek, we had heard that in the male institutions, they had ice machines, and we had no ice machines at Coffee Creek. Finally, they put an ice machine into the incentive unit. But you have to understand there are 108 women in the unit. So one ice machine cannot keep up adequately when we're having a heat wave with all the women who want to have cold water. So we would be allowed 1 cup of ice. You would line up and wait for the ice machine to catch up and make your 1 cup of ice, and you would see all the cups lined up. And then, of course, because the incentive unit was the only unit that had an ice machine, there was an active trade to other units to try to get ice. And so people would literally get penalized for being caught with ice in their cup if they didn't live in the incentive unit. So it was almost like they weaponized ice. Unfortunately, well, towards the end of my stay, and I was there for quite some time, uh, we did have a superintendent that came and said, ice, why is ice an incentive? And so she put ice machines in on every unit. Even with that, in the summertime when there was a heat wave, the ice machines could not keep up with the demand for ice, because that was the only thing that we had that was available. So they did begin bringing in some buckets of ice from the kitchen, but that still wasn't enough to keep everyone with cool water to drink.
Yeah, I remember that was one of the things that we had brought up when we were writing to the Governor Brown, about how they had weaponized ice. But I do want to, since you brought it up, Julie, I know you had a question.
I just wanted to ask if they could share the creative ways people try to have some relief from this.
That's where I was headed. Can you talk a little bit about like what was available to you to be able to provide relief, and at what cost, and then what are some of the creative ways that were sort of, not official in the way that you could stay cool?
Well, prior to ice being available on different units, you could figure out ways to sneak ice to where you lived that didn't have ice. Or there were also, if you were in different work sites, they would have ice available to you during the workday because, well, you don't want a bunch of irritable workers answering the telephone if you're dealing with the public, if you're doing any kind of production work. So they would bring in coolers of ice water. And so those of us who worked in those areas would try to take ice back to our housing units to be able to give to other people, because we knew they had been without all day long. So it was against the rules. And if you got caught, you were sent to you got a cell in. So you got to sit in your hot box for trying to cool it off. I was very fortunate because I was one of the dog handlers at Coffee Creek. And as dog handler, we had access to multiple towels because we would bathe our animals, sometimes twice a month, 3 times a month. So we would take towels and wet them down and put them on our cell floor just so that there was something cool. And as they dried, we would pour pitchers of water on them and keep them wet the entire time, just to create some kind of convection cooling. It did happen that during the summer one year, our HVAC system broke down, which stopped the swamp coolers from working. So even that small movement of air, and it also stopped our toilet system from working because it was all on an HVAC system. So you live in a bathroom, and then if your plumbing doesn't work, you're living in your sewer. So it was very horrible. And it lasted for about 3 days. And sometimes the air temperature in the cells would get so hot that the toilet itself, the outside of the toilet, which is stainless steel, would sweat. So if you can imagine, that's just room temperature water that was cooler than the ambient air because it was so hot in the cells.
So towels on the floor is what you're telling me. And then sneaking ice from the work site. So when you would sneak ice, how would you sneak ice back into your cell or back with you?
Well, I'm not very good at sneaking. So I'll be honest, I just put my ice in a cup and walk down the corridor. And it's kind of, I don't know. I don't know if it was just the boldness of it. I never got stopped, and no one ever questioned where I was going or what I was doing. I think it was even more obvious if people had pitchers. So usually, if you were walking around the institution with a pitcher full of ice, but people would try anything because it was so hot. They were willing to risk the punishment just to help cool people down.
Yeah. How about you, Mark? What were some of the things that were available to you? I know you had mentioned some stuff that you could purchase, but what were some of the creative things people had to do to stay cool at OSCI?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm all for making sure that the pets, the dogs, were cool. But it's interesting that being a dog handler gave you more ability to be cool than everybody else in the prison because they wanted to cool the pets, but not the inmates. So that's interesting to me. But yeah, in our job sites, there were no water coolers, there were no ice. They didn't give a damn. That didn't happen. Uh, yeah, it's really hard to get cool, especially in those prisons that I was in, because they are so old. You're in the cell. The only place to sit in the cell is your bunk. And you have to have your bed made all the time, they give you wool blankets, so that makes it worse, right? So you immediately in the summertime strip your blankets and your sheets off your bed, and then you're just like on this hot plastic, which is in there, the covering of the bed. So it's not good there either. But yeah, and until they sold some of these items, and again, they're incentive items. So if you were a good boy, you could get them, but if you were not good enough, you suffered without them. So cooling towels was one of the things they sold. And so before that, people would wet their towels and in the sink and try to use that to cool off, but it only lasted a few minutes. The cooling towels kind of helped a little bit longer than that. They began selling these really rinky-dink small fans for like $50, and I mean, you got to
$50.
yeah, and it's like that's
And then
an entire month's pay.
Yeah, can you contextualize like how long it takes to save $50?
Well, I had one of the best paying jobs in the institution. I made $70 a month, right? And most prisoners make $20-$30 a month at best. And again, that was an incentive item. So that was the people that were probably in the best job. So they were probably paying a month's pay for that thing. And, it takes a long time to get it and that kind of thing. But, and the fan, I mean, it's moving hot air, I mean, so what's, yeah, you feel the air blow by, but it's hot air blowing by. And so, a lot of people would, so we have these legal totes. You're supposed to keep your legal papers in a low plastic container. People would take their legal papers out of the tote and fill it with water, and then maybe put their feet in the water, or they would devise some way of making a swamp cooler with their fan in the water in the tote. And it's just there were all kinds of ways that people were trying to find to get cool. And it's funny that Angela says that the women thought the men's prison always had ice machines, because I was laughing as she was talking about it, because we had the same problem. Yes, it was only in the incentive unit, which had 220 some odd prisoners in it. And so, yeah, once a day or twice a day, they'd call ice line, and all 200 people would line up for a cup full of ice. And it's like, what is this? It's just ridiculous. And, it's really a frustrating situation. So yeah, there was rarely any way you could get cool. A lot of people would try, at nighttime, because it was so hot still, some people would try to just lay down on the cement floor at night to try to sleep. But even then, it's still 80 plus degrees in there. Both people can't sleep on the floor, so only one person's doing that. It didn't really help. you're just miserable the whole time, and everybody's just dreading when they're saying the hot temperatures are coming and can't wait for it to end. And fortunately here in Oregon, we have kind of a short period of time when that happens, at least in the valley. But some of these other prisons, Arizona, it's year round. And
Well, in Oregon, when I first moved up here in 2003, it was uncommon for people to have air conditioners, and there would be at least like 1 or 2 days, maybe like a week at most, like 90 plus degree weather, and that was considered extreme. I just remember it'd be like 1 or 2 days, and I would spend those 2 days like in the movie theaters. Like that's what I would do. I didn't have AC in my apartment, but it was short lived. It was just one of those things. But we may not be in the Southwest, but these hot days, like the average temp days, are extending. Like you're seeing now weeks where we're upper 80s, lower 90s. A week or two where we're teetering on the edge of like 100-degree weather, and so they are getting longer and predictable. Where every June and July, which then dominoes into like wildfires, and that creates a whole different type of chaos or weather condition. But you now that we have like a better sense of what it feels like and what's available to stay cool. I mean, one, I think it's deplorable that they make the scarcity of basic things like ice, where it becomes something like where it's
An
just
incentive.
like an incentive or a commodity that people are seeking out as as if it's something that people shouldn't have or deserve, just as a basic thing. You guys alluded to sort of the consequences or the impacts on AICs. Can you speak a little bit more about what you would see, like the impact on people, like whether it's elderly individuals or people that had like mental health issues or people who had other chronic illnesses, maybe people who did have illnesses but were just more sensitive to heat? What kinds of things would you see as far as the impact on individuals?
It was really obvious at Coffee Creek, and especially among the women in the elderly population. The heat was really hard on them physically, and you're already walking on concrete all the time. And so you see people who, you can't move around a lot. You're told to sit down all the time. You would see a lot of women who had lots of swelling and would develop edema in their legs and their lower extremities. People who had compromised circulatory issues, they had all kinds of complications from that also. Retaining water, swelling, and the heat exacerbates all of those things. People who had autoimmune system disorders, especially like multiple sclerosis or lupus, they get flare-ups when their body temperature rises. And so you would see people go into crisis, have medical crisis from that. You have more people who would, like Mark had said, pass out from the heat, not drinking enough water. And also the prison diet tends to be a little higher in sodium, and the things that you get off of canteen are very processed, so they're very high in sodium also. So you would see people who would have problems with that, either dehydration or lots of swelling. So it was really impacting people's health, not just the fact that it was uncomfortable. And for people who had mental health issues, you can imagine what the heat does just to the average person and makes you irritable. And so people who have mental health issues, it impacts, their stability also. They just really have a much harder time and struggle in those kinds of extreme temperatures.
Yeah, Mark, what would you see as far as the impacts?
Yeah, it's the same things Angela was talking about. It's not different between males and females. And the other thing I think that Angela didn't mention is that a lot of people, a lot of the elderly prisoners, a lot of the mentally ill prisoners are on medications that are impacted by heat and sun exposure and that kind of thing. And so they have negative consequences from their or negative reactions from their medications. I don't know if you can speak to that. I can't, Angela, about how sun impacts some of those medications, but I have seen people have medical issues because they were on a medication and had heat exposure. And so, but
It
yeah,
can make the medication not as effective. I mean, I don't have any major medical issues, but just during the summertime when it was super hot, I would have swelling in my ankles and my feet that I normally don't have. I don't suffer from those issues, but just because of the heat, and of course, walking on the concrete and then not being allowed to move around adequately. And so when they would shut the yards down, you didn't have the ability to go out and walk laps because they were worried about people going out in the heat and collapsing, which is a very real fear. You know, they were trying to protect people from that, but then people would go into the aerobics room and work out. They have no way to cool down after they've raised their body temperature, and those kinds of things can become very debilitating for people. It can be very dangerous medically also.
Would you see an uptick during these extreme weather events, like the heat, extreme heat, like into the infirmary for heat related or conditions exacerbated by heat, like medical issues?
You would see more people who would go down to the medical clinic with complaints to be seen. People who suffer from migraines would have debilitating headaches for multiple days, be going down and getting their medications for that. So you do see an upswing in medical visits. Not that they were necessarily seeing a provider, but they would go down to the clinic for what they would, say is an emergency. It didn't mean that anybody was being admitted into the infirmary.
and at OSCI, when they would allow us outside during the heat, and someone had a heat related medical issue, they typically would take them to the hospital by ambulance. And then at that point, and that happened in multiple times, or happens, I should say, multiple times a year in the summer months. And when that happens, then they don't have the staff to supervise the yard anymore. So they close the yard and put everyone back in their cage. So while the person goes by ambulance to the hospital for their heat stroke. So yeah, that happens regularly.
And can you speak a little bit about hydration? I mean, what was the availability of water for individuals? I mean, was that easily available? You had a tap, in your cell. I mean, could people stay hydrated during these times?
You can stay hydrated. However, people are not really good about drinking water, and especially if the water is not cool. So you have people who just, I think because they just don't know, they just are unaware of those things. So they will drink water or they'll make iced coffee or they'll make iced tea and those things are still dehydrating because there's quite a bit of sodium in coffee. And so people think if it's cool, that it's cooling me down, but it's not hydrating them adequately. And so you did find people who would get very dehydrated very quickly. Once we had ice machines, it was much more likely that people would drink water and stay hydrated. But people had a distrust of the water that was coming from the tap in their room. There were lots of very interesting theories about the water that would come out of the tap. So the majority of women that I lived with would go and get boiling water from the hot water tap and let it cool overnight. So it was hard to cool your water down adequately and to get enough water to drink because you didn't have the number of pitchers necessary to gather water and cool it off.
I am glad you said that, Angela. Yeah, at OSCI and OSP, you have sinks in your cell, but I never wanted to drink the water. I mean, it's brown. There's chunks coming out. I mean, it's like, what in the hell is going on here? I mean, it's like you get to the point where you do not want to drink out of your sink at all. I mean, you what is this? I mean, it looks like it's like rusted metal out of the pipes or something, and it's just like, no, this cannot be healthy. It's you push the button to have water in your sink, and then there's sediment in the bottom of your sink afterwards. It's like, I'm not drinking that, so no, a lot of people do not want to drink the water.
That does not sound good.
No, it does not.
Um,
And that's not a theory. I saw it,
yeah.
lived it.
I mean, when this is more of a global question, like, year after year, you're exposed and experiencing this type of environment. And as you get into like the hot summer months, it's going to be tough. Does this impact, like, does visitation go down during this time? How does you're talking about like how you can't go out to yard? Are there social events that happen? I mean, how does sort of the rhythm of the prison, social activities and things like that, does that get disrupted during this period, or do people not feel engaged with that, or how does that all work? I remember one year there was a powwow at OSCI, but it was during like a 90-degree weather, and it's out and just in an open field. I mean, they didn't let us come in, but I was thinking about it. Had I had to go in that day, I was like, man, it just feels like it's going to be a really miserable day, although in good company, but very
Well, what
miserable.
made it more miserable is that they refused to allow prisoners to wear their shorts to the event. They had to wear denim jeans. And so they were out in this 90+ degree weather without cover for, let's see, when did it start? It was like 8 o'clock in the morning until like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just cooking in their denim pants in the sun, because that was the price you paid for going to the event.
Yeah, that sounds terrible. But I mean, do things get kind of disrupted, or do you just have these events and sort of bear it? Just, you just have to kind of endure the heat.
Yeah, so every summer at Coffee Creek, they hold an event for families, mothers and children and grandparents. And it's hosted by the Wilsonville Rotary Club, called Through a Child's Eyes. And it's set up like a carnival, and it's outside for 3.5 hours. And we were allowed to wear shorts to the event. However, we were also very aware of the fact that those of us who got to either participate in the event or volunteer and work the event, it took all the staff away from the institution because they were out watching all of us on the yard. And so the rest of the institution was locked down for the 2 days that we held the event, because one day medium would go and the next day minimum would go to the event. And it was always the weekend after the 4th of July. It was very hot and everyone else was locked down in their cells. So while we were on the yard in the breeze or with our families, or even if it was hot, we could have as many snow cones as we wanted at the event. Everyone else was locked down in their cell. And we were very aware of that. It was hard to know that everybody else was suffering while we got to go out and spend the day with our families.
Yeah, same thing at the men's prison. They'll be family first, would be fathers and their kids having an event like the annual carnival, which is uh, runs for 5 or 6 hours that day, where the fathers and their kids can play in a carnival like atmosphere out in front of the prison. The powwow that you just mentioned, Bob, and that's another 30 to 40 prisoners that get to attend that. And then she's right, every other prisoner is locked in their cell because they claim they don't have the staffing to allow them to have yard. And so then everybody else resents the 30 to 40 or 50 people that got to go to the event while they suffered in their cells. And instead of focusing on who made that decision, they're focusing on the people that benefited from it, unfortunately. So that creates animosities and whatnot. But
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like how all these different things end up becoming sort of weaponized or used against you in some way, whether and or creates like tensions within.
Well, honestly, I think there is I believe there is a a strategy, a desire amongst prison officials nationwide, I think, not just in Oregon, that, I mean, you pit prisoners against each other because, that makes it easier to manage them because they're not in solidarity against you, the administration. So you want prisoners, fractionalized amongst their peer group so that you can manage them easier, and so they take every opportunity they can to do that, and they do it well.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, as you have, as people have to endure this year after year in these conditions, how does that affect like your own sort of like psyche as far as, I don't know, just who you are and what you mean and things like that. Is it something that you understand is, just inherently incorrect and this is not how people should be treated? Or do people become sort of like accustomed to this and begin to think like, this is what they deserve, or this is all you basically, does it, when people get exposed and experience something for prolonged periods of time, it sort of shifts it shifts their expectations of themselves and what to expect. So, yeah, I don't know if that question makes sense, but
Yeah, I was a dog handler for 10 years at Coffee Creek, and we trained dogs to be assistance dogs for Canines Companions for Independence. And there were a couple of times when things happened, and one of them was in the summertime when it would get very hot. Our dog training room was air conditioned. So we as a handler, that was a benefit. We spent a lot of time in the training classroom with our dogs because it was cool. When the heat would get so high that it would become harmful, we were instructed to leave our dogs in the dog training room to sleep overnight. And then we went back to our hot cells. And the message that came through was that the dogs are much more important than humans. And that was mentally, that was something hard to wrap your head around. And it happened, one time our water supply was threatened with some kind of algae, and everyone was told not to drink the water. We saw it on the news, and they brought in water for the staff, and they brought in water for the dogs. And we were told we could continue to drink the tap water. So, it that's hard. That's a
yeah.
hard thing to mentally deal with, to realize that you are considered worthless. The dog is more important than you are.
Yeah, it seems like there's like consistent or persistent sort of actions or efforts being taken or decisions being made that kind of reinforce, that your lives are not worth very much, like not worth the value of ice, which is, frozen water, not worth the ability to have access to clean water, not worth the ability to have, fans or, simple items that can help you stay cool. um and I just wonder in the long term how harmful that is to one's own esteem, psychology, and what that means for people when we're expecting them to come back into the community, of how they engage with the community and what they believe that they are expected to have, and what kind of value they place on themselves, and yeah, it seems very challenging and and I think all unnecessary. Like there's no reason why in 2025 why there shouldn't be, like, the state shouldn't be investing in like air conditioning. It's an expense, but that's all it is. It's an expense, and people just have to pay for it. I mean, it doesn't seem like, I know money is always hard, but you're talking about, again, individual life, or to have clean, cool water available to people, to have ice available to everyone. I mean, this is all seemingly should be simple stuff.
Well, we've started seeing some of that around the country. I mean, first, let me say to your comment, Angela, and yours, Bobbin, that yeah, you can't help but internalize that message that you are not worthy of human dignity, essentially. Um, and so to your question about that, Bob, and I think that you have a large majority of people in prison have heard that their whole life. have already internalized that and already believe that about themselves, and this just reinforces that and kind of keeps them in a really negative mindset and a negative view of their place in the world. And yeah, I mean, how do you heal and become a better person? If we're trying to put out someone that's safe to the community and is a good neighbor, that's not the way you want it. I mean, you don't want to kick them while they're in prison and expect them to come out and be good, happy, neighbors that you would want living next door to you. I mean, I can understand why people would, it would perpetuate the depression and the violence and self-hatred and that kind of stuff. But for your point about, it's an expense that people have to pay, this comes down to this long time. I mean, it's a deeply held belief in the general population, even I see, but largely, but in the prison administration, is that you're a prisoner, you don't deserve this kind of treatment. But like medical care, climate control is something that because it does cause health risks. There are constitutional rights around that, and we're starting to see around the country that courts are weighing in favor of prisoners on that, and making prisons make some reforms around climate control in some of these places where it's just really extreme and endless, like Alabama and Georgia and Texas. Places you wouldn't see courts ruling in favor of prisoners generally, but they are starting to do that around issues of extreme temperature because it is detrimental to people's health. And I think not just physical health, but mental well-being is kind of the point you were just making. And I just don't know how you can't, I mean, we're all impacted by our environment all the time. And when you're in an environment that is always, reinforcing the message that you are less than human and you don't deserve basic human, accommodation and dignity, I mean, how do you not start to believe that, when you're in that for 20, 30 years or more,
Yeah. I mean, it's still sort of blows my mind away that how distant these experiences are, these realities are for the general public and also public officials. And it just made me kind of think about, we've had this idea of building like a replica cell here in Oregon to put it in the Capitol, but now I'm thinking we have to figure out how to add a heating component to it to replicate a hot day.
The hot box, yeah.
Yeah. And, essentially it would be just like a sauna, for people to have to sit in.
Go sit in there for 15 minutes and then imagine being in there for 24 hours. I mean, you're in there literally trying to write and your paper is curling and, you can't do anything.
Yeah. It sounds horrible. And I know we've been aware of these issues and, have tried to advocate for more legislative involvement. And, at the end of the day, it's just one of these things where the legislature just doesn't seem to want to tell DOC to fix this stuff or invest in infrastructure.
I think a lot of those lawmakers have those same prejudices against prisoners and the same fears that if they are willing to push for these kind of reforms for prisoners, somehow that makes them soft on crime and therefore they're going to get voted out of office. And so they can't do it.
Yeah.
Which, so again, human dignity is apparently soft on crime. And it's just wrong and morally wrong. And I don't know, I'm not sure how our decision makers live with themselves. I guess they just compartmentalize and give themselves, narratives about who we are and what we deserve. And that's, that makes it okay, I guess.
I don't know how we crack that code, how we get the legislature. I mean, this has been our big push, is how to get the legislature more engaged in creating mandates. It always comes to, I think that tension that you're talking about, Mark, is, when legislators, it's always sort of, well, we have a limited amount of money or a finite amount of money, and my constituents are going to say, why are we paying for AC in prisons when these housings out in the community need ACs? Like, it should be us that gets it, not people in custody. And, it's that false trade-off,
Yeah.
that
But again,
binary, I guess.
here we're back to the same thing again. Okay, so this costs money. Well, how do you find the money to do this? You reduce your prison population. You
Mhm.
have a whole bunch of people in prison at, I think they said on the website most recently, $173 a day. That's like $62,000 a year to incarcerate 12,000 people in Oregon. But they know by their own data that a large percentage of those people can be are low risk of repeat offenses and can be adequately controlled with supervision in the community, which they also acknowledge is $13 a day, which is like $4,000 a day. So why aren't those people in the community on supervision at $4,000 instead of $60,000? And then you use that money that you've reduced your prison population by to put AC or drug treatment or whatever else you're trying to fund into the prison for the people that need to be there.
Yeah.
We
I think you meant
are
$4,000 a year, right? Not a day.
$4,000 a year, $13 a day. I'm sorry. Yes. Yes. Yeah. And so, it is our addiction to punishment that we need to get over. And nobody seems to want to do that, because this is a voiceless, powerless group of people that nobody cares about. And apparently people believe don't deserve human dignity.
Yeah. I mean, that seems evident from all the efforts that we try to push forward with the legislature. But this one, we'll keep trying to advocate for and trying to bring to light. I think we have to adjust sort of our strategy and the ways we engage with public officials to get them to understand the severity and harm that this is creating. I mean, the severity of the issue and the harm that it's having on people. But any last sort of thoughts or comments, Angela?
I just think that the message that really comes through in so many ways when you go into prison is that you are not human. You're less than human. You don't deserve to be treated as a human being. And that gives them license to do so many things and to just devalue the value of life, of human beings. You're not looked at as a human being anymore. You're less than. And that message comes through clearly.
Yeah. Julia, any lasting thought or last thoughts or comments?
Just, at like thinking about that and thinking about, yes, there's definitely a need for infrastructure changes. I do wonder if the fact that we go through these hot seasons and then we're not in a hot season again, because this comes up every summer, but once we're out of the summer, we're not talking about this anymore. And so in some of these other places where it's hotter for longer year round, maybe you can hold people's attention a little more if you could get them to care a little more about this. But in the meantime, with the infrastructure, conversation being on hold, it always just strikes me at how those individual human interactions are lacking in terms of consideration and care. And so what Angela's saying about how people don't feel like humans in prison, the story that Mark shared about the powwow and the fact that the guys couldn't wear shorts, knowing they were going to be out in that extreme heat, seems completely unnecessary. And it just seems like throughout the day, there are this lack of consideration for this basic human needs that you can do from a person to person. But I think the culture is just so punitive that it just exacerbates, all the infrastructure problems that exist in the prison.
Yeah. It all comes down to culture. And, until we change the culture, which I don't think is ever going to happen, you're going to have this continue to be a problem.
Yeah. I mean, it seems all to come back to like the value system that you're talking about, like this value system of punishment, dominance, control. And this is just, one aspect of it that, it doesn't really matter. As Angela, you said, dogs are considered more worthy of humane treatment than the individuals inside our prisons. But I just want to thank you both, Mark and Angela, for sharing your experiences with us and, letting us hear more about what it's like. And like I said, this is something that we'll continue to try to figure out ways to advocate for. And see if we can bring some changes. I mean, the danger that we always get into with this is you bring up infrastructure changes, DOC immediately pounces on, well, we got to build a new prison.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's a very delicate conversation for us to be able to try to advance, because that's not the consequence or that output or the outcome that we're looking for. And it's a
Well,
very real outcome that could happen if we push too hard on this issue.
yeah, and again, I think the culture and the value system has to change before the infrastructure changes, because as long as you're building a prison in the culture we're in, it's a punitive mindset and model that they want to build. And so until our governor and our lawmakers or our courts, which I can't ever see happening either, get to the point where they tell the prison administration that you have to have a different mindset when it comes to interacting with the people that you incarcerate, it's going to be punitive and damaging. And so, I mean, and it's going to be locking up massive numbers of people for as long as possible and not treating them as human beings. And so, the culture always has to come before the infrastructure. And it's just, there's no will to change that.
Yeah. Well, Julia, Mark, Angela, thank you for your time today. We'll be back next week with another episode of Trailblazing Justice. Next week, we hope to have Juan Chavez to come on and talk about the Civil Rights Project and the work of the Civil Rights Project from some cases that resolved and got started last week. We had a very busy week. We were able to settle 2 cases that involved the city of Portland. One involved a $3.75 million settlement with Manny Clark Johnson. Another one was for $62,500 from a protest case in which our client basically got thrown to the ground for spitting in the direction of police officers. Ridiculous case. And then we initiated a lawsuit for an individual who died in the back of a police car because they left him there and essentially overheated in the back of a car. And so it was a significant week for the Civil Rights Project, and Juan will be on to talk about those cases and some of the other work that the Civil Rights Project's doing. But we'll be back next week. As always, thanks for listening to Trailblazing Justice, and thanks to Todd Davila, our producer. See you next week.